The instant Marla Whitaker tried to have my boat hauled away was the very second she basically signed her own eviction notice. I'm sitting in my battered aluminum fishing skiff, savoring the dawn mist, drifting over Crystal Lake when I catch the growl of a luxury yacht engine ripping through the quiet. This spotless white status symbol rockets toward me, and posed at the bow like some maritime Napoleon stands this perfectly coiffed woman in designer shoreline attire, bellowing at full volume. This is private property. Remove that rust bucket now. The sharp tang of her yacht's premium fuel mingled with her overpowering perfume as she edged alongside my humble rig. The soft slap of water on my hull suddenly felt like the calm ahead of a very expensive squall. I just grinned, took another pull of coffee, and said, "Ma'am, you might want to double-check your paperwork on that. What would you do if some stranger insisted they owned the water under your boat? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I bet your town has a Marla just like this one." Let me rewind and explain how I landed in this mess. My name's Evan Carter, and 3 months earlier I'd inherited my grandfather's small lakeside cabin after he passed at 89. Granddad had been my anchor after my divorce went nuclear. You know how it is when attorneys step in and suddenly your savings evaporate faster than morning dew. I wrench for a living as a marine mechanic, so I've got motor oil permanently ground under my nails and the kind of back that creaks like old dock boards when I climb out of bed. But Granddad always said, honest work beats easy money. Sitting on his sun-grayed dock with a mug of coffee, watching mist lift off Crystal Lake, I finally understood what he meant. This lake, all 200 acres of clear water wrapped in old-growth forest, used to be the community swim hole in Granddad's day. He told stories about summer festivals, kids learning their first strokes, families gathering on the public beach. Over the last decade, though, million-dollar houses sprouted along the shoreline like pricey mushrooms after rain. My cabin stuck out like a sore thumb against all that wealth. While neighbors flaunted manicured lawns and boat lifts that cost more than my truck, I kept a patch of wildflowers and a simple wooden dock held together with hope and marine-grade screws. Enter Marla Whitaker. Marla moved here from the city about 5 years back and immediately crowned herself the unofficial mayor of what she dubbed Crystal Lake Estates. Picture a woman in her early 50s who's never met a problem she couldn't attack with a clipboard and a condescending smile. She drives a white BMW that stays cleaner than most kitchens, and I swear she presses her casual lake outfits. The first time I met Marla, I was swapping spark plugs on my 1987 Lund fishing boat. Nothing fancy, but she runs true and takes me where the fish hunker down. The aluminum hull wore that honest patina from years afloat, unlike the gleaming fiberglass showpieces tied to the pricey docks. Marla stepped onto my dock wearing white pants that probably cost more than my monthly groceries, her heels ticking across the weathered planks like a countdown clock. She used that sugar-coated tone rich folks deploy right before they ruin your afternoon. "Excuse me," she said, consulting her ever-present clipboard. "I'm Marla Whitaker, HOA president for Crystal Lake Estates. I need to address your watercraft situation." The way she said watercraft made my little rig sound like a floating trash can. I wiped my hands on an old rag that reeked of two-stroke and introduced myself. "Evan Carter. Nice to meet you, Mr. Carter. I'm afraid your vessel violates our community standards." She handed me an official-looking document with more letterhead than a divorce decree. "This is a cease and desist notice. You have 48 hours to remove your boat from our private lake." I skimmed the flowery legalese while she tapped manicured fingers impatiently. The letter claimed my boat threatened property values, offended aesthetic standards, and might create environmental hazards. It was signed by some county seat law firm with a name longer than my boat. "Ma'am, I've been fishing this lake since I was knee-high to a grasshopper," I said, returning her papers. "My grandfather, I understand. You have sentimental attachments," she cut in with that smile folks wear right before they crush your hopes. "But this is private property now. We've invested significant resources in preserving the lake's pristine character." As she spoke, her expensive fragrance drifted into the clean smell of lake water and pines. It felt like someone had dropped a department store into the woods. "If you don't comply voluntarily," Marla continued, "we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies, including having your boat towed at your expense." She offered a business card, cream stock so thick you could build a dock with it. Then she click-clacked back to her BMW, leaving me with a legal threat in one hand and a greasy plug in the other. That's when I realized this wasn't about a boat. It was about whether money gets to erase history, whether communities belong to the people who built them, or the ones who can afford to buy them. Marla didn't waste time turning up the heat. Within a week, she'd staged what she called an emergency HOA meeting about undesirable elements endangering their lakeside paradise. I wasn't invited, but word moves fast in small places, especially when it's rich folks plotting against the local grease monkey. She circulated a petition titled "Protecting Our Investment and Community Values," because nothing says neighborly like reducing people to property values. The petition showcased photos of my boat from multiple angles, like some maritime mugshot. She even posted them in the neighborhood Facebook group with captions about deteriorating standards and precedent-setting decisions. Now I need to explain something about lake communities. They're like high school cafeterias. Everyone knows their table, and crossing social lines makes people twitchy. Marla was rousing the Mercedes and BMW crowd with fear tactics that could make a politician jealous. "What's next?" she posted online. "RV parks? Trailer homes? We must act before our sanctuary becomes a public campground." The whisper campaign started immediately. Neighbors who'd waved before began crossing the street when they saw me. Anonymous complaints landed at the county office claiming my boat leaked oil, which was absurd since I maintain my gear better than most folks maintain their marriages. A few residents approached me with apologetic warnings. "Evan, we've got nothing against you personally, but Marla says property values could drop 20% if this gets out of hand. Here's the thing about bullies. They count on targets feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Marla's strategy was textbook intimidation. Box me in with legal threats and social pressure until I slunk away quietly. But she misjudged me. She figured I was just a simple mechanic who'd fold. Time for my first counterpunch. I spent my Saturday in the county courthouse, a musty brick relic that smells like old coffee and shelved disappointments. The property records office lives in the basement, staffed by clerks who've witnessed every land feud imaginable. I laid out my situation to Ruth Kowalski, a woman who'd been filing deeds since before Marla learned to wield a clipboard. Crystal Lake, huh? Ruth's eyebrows rose like she'd just recognized a familiar soap opera. That's a tangled history, right there. She slid out plat books that looked older than my grandfather, their pages yellowed and fragile as autumn leaves. "Your grandfather, good man. He used to bring me tomatoes from his garden." Ruth traced the boundaries with a gnarled finger. "Thing is, lake ownership gets tricky when you're dealing with natural water bodies." That's when she pointed to something intriguing. The original deed to my grandfather's place carried language about water rights and historic access privileges, legal jargon that might as well have been ancient Greek, but Ruth translated it plainly. My grandfather held rights beyond his simple stretch of shoreline. The question became, what happened to those rights when all these fancy houses sprang up? We copied everything: deeds, surveys, old plat maps. The copier wheezed like a tired outboard, but it spat out evidence that made my pulse climb. The mini-twist came when Ruth mentioned a bit that made my coffee go cold. There was a major fight over this lake back in the 60s. Multiple ownership claims, federal involvement, the whole 9 yards. Far as I know, never truly settled. Just got buried when the developers rolled in. She tugged out another file box. Might be worth checking the state environmental office, too. Lakes like this sometimes carry protected status that outranks local property claims. I left the courthouse with a box of documents and a head full of possibilities. Marla thought she was pushing a straightforward trespass case. This was shaping up like a water rights battle that could shake the foundation of her precious gated enclave. That evening, I sat on my dock sorting papers while my fishing line drifted in the lazy current. The sun slid behind Marla's mansion, throwing long shadows across water that might not be as privately owned as everyone assumed. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Last warning, remove boat or face consequences. Concerned citizens of Crystal Lake. I smiled and cast again. Marla had graduated from legal threats to anonymous intimidation. In my experience, that meant her position wasn't as ironclad as she pretended. Time to learn exactly what my grandfather had been protecting all these years. Now, here's something most folks don't realize. Always check original property deeds when someone claims exclusive ownership of natural features like lakes or beaches. Plenty of private areas got that way through paperwork sleight of hand, not legitimate ownership. 6 months later, Crystal Lake looked like a painting come alive, morning mist curling off waters that now belonged to everyone again, carrying the laughter of children and the rhythmic splash of fishing lines hitting the surface. The Crystal Lake Public Trust had officially been formed, with me as the volunteer federal steward. The job didn't pay much, but it gave me purpose beyond anything I'd imagined. My grandfather's old cabin had been transformed into the Visitor Education Center, where families learned about conservation, local history, and why public resources mattered. The free boat launch buzzed with activity each weekend, and the modest entry fees covered upkeep while keeping the lake affordable for working families. The smell of grilled fish mingled with the pine-sweet air of preserved wilderness. What surprised everyone was how quickly the community healed once Marla's toxic influence vanished. Property values actually stabilized once the legal chaos was resolved, and the honest homeowners received federal compensation for developer-induced losses. Our shared stewardship model became a template studied in environmental law programs across the country. Marla's ending, though, wasn't nearly as idyllic. Convicted on multiple federal charges, harassment, fraud, and threatening government officials, she was sentenced to 2 years of community service. The irony of a woman who tried to privatize a public lake now working for the public good was delicious. Her bankruptcy proceedings stripped her of everything: the mansion, the yacht, even the white BMW that had strutted across my dock months before. Last I heard, she'd moved to another state, probably hunting for a fresh neighborhood to terrorize. Her husband, Robert Whitaker, turned into one of our strongest allies. Freed from his wife's legal hurricane and her spending habits, he discovered a passion for environmental volunteering, mentoring local kids, and repairing the damage she'd caused. The ripple effects spread far beyond our little lake. The legal precedent we set had already been cited in dozens of similar cases across several states, uncovering over 200 illegally privatized water bodies. Congressional hearings on public trust protections soon followed, strengthening community access laws nationwide. For me, the transformation was deeply personal. The bitterness from my divorce felt like something that had happened to someone else. My role as environmental steward had introduced me to Dr. Emily Tran, whose legal expertise had evolved into something far more personal and lasting. But the truest reward was realizing my grandfather's legacy. His tales about the lake belonging to everyone weren't nostalgia. They were a mission statement from a man who'd quietly safeguarded something precious for decades. The grandfather's memorial scholarship, funded by visitor donations and federal grants, had already helped 3 local students pursue degrees in environmental science. Agnes Murphy had been our first scholarship presenter, her trembling hands holding the check she passed to Maria Santos, a bright young woman whose family had once been priced out of lake access. The changes were everywhere. Teenagers now found meaningful work maintaining trails and teaching visitors about nature. Senior citizens enjoyed accessible fishing platforms designed for wheelchairs, and families who couldn't afford pricey clubs finally had a place to gather outdoors. But my favorite change was the sound. Gone was the roar of luxury yachts and entitled voices. Now the lake hummed with the gentle putter of small boats, the laughter of children learning to swim, and the chatter of families reclaiming what had always been theirs. On summer nights, I still sat on my grandfather's dock, though I was rarely alone. The weekly community fish fry had become a beloved ritual. Families from every background sharing fresh-caught fish and stories beneath a sky mirrored in public water. Wood smoke drifted through the air, blending with the earthy scent of the lake lapping the shore. Kids learned to cast from seasoned anglers, and elders swapped stories with the young parents, building new traditions. Agnes, now 88 and sharp as ever, often joined me to watch the sunset. "You know what your grandfather would say about all this?" she asked one evening as we watched kids skipping stones where Marla's yacht once floated. "What's that?" I asked. "He'd say you finally learned that some things are worth more than money. They're worth fighting for." As autumn painted the shoreline in gold and crimson, I realized the fight had given me something I'd never expected: a community, a purpose, and proof that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they stand together. The week before the town hall meeting, Marla went full scorched earth. Her first desperate move was trying to have me arrested on made-up charges. She called the sheriff, claiming I'd been lurking around her property and making threatening gestures from my boat. Sheriff Douglas, a level-headed man who'd known my grandfather for years, showed up at my dock wearing an apologetic look and holding a warrant he clearly wished didn't exist. "Evan, I've got to ask, have you been bothering Mrs. Whitaker?" he said. "Only if catching fish counts as harassment," I replied, raising my modest morning catch. "You're welcome to check my tackle box for assault weapons." Douglas couldn't help but chuckle. "Look, this whole mess is out of hand. Just stay visible out there, okay? Witnesses help everyone." But that was just the opening act. Marla's next masterpiece was attempting to bribe the town hall's maintenance crew into double booking the venue with a wedding reception. Funny how a $1,000 donation to the church building fund suddenly produced scheduling conflicts. When that failed, she hired a crisis management firm from the city to flood social media with rumors about government land seizures. Within days, local Facebook groups were ablaze with talk of federal takeovers and property confiscation. The smell of panic was thicker than diesel exhaust from her yacht. Her radio interview was pure manipulation art. Hard-working families could lose their homes to bureaucratic overreach, she declared, voice trembling with fake sincerity. "This isn't about lake access. It's about whether Americans still have property rights." The smear campaign against me kicked into high gear. Anonymous flyers plastered store windows with unflattering pictures of my boat beside warnings about outside agitators. My divorce records mysteriously leaked, fueling whispers about instability and resentment towards successful people. Worst of all, Marla hired social media bots to flood comment sections with copy-paste outrage about government tyranny. The sabotage soon turned physical. Someone slashed all 4 tires on my truck the night before the meeting, ensuring I'd need a tow instead of a spare. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. Luckily, Tony Ritchie's veterans group had been expecting dirty tricks. They'd been quietly monitoring my property and caught the vandal on camera, a private security contractor, whose employment traced straight back to Marla's crisis management firm. "Ma'am," Tony told me with grim satisfaction, "we've got her dead to rights, witness intimidation, and property destruction. Federal charges if we push it." The morning sound check at the town hall brought another coincidence. The main audio system was mysteriously destroyed during overnight cleaning. The manager looked mortified as he explained. "Must have been an accident." Sure it was. By now, Marla's desperation reeked like low tide. She was throwing cash at the problem faster than a gambler feeding a slot machine. Lawyers, private investigators, PR consultants, you name it. Rumor had it her husband Robert was visiting bankruptcy lawyers in town. The community was splitting down the middle, wealthy homeowners posting private property rights banners, while modest neighborhoods countered with handmade public access for all signs. Even local businesses picked sides with their window displays. Then came Marla's biggest blunder, threatening Janet Morales, the federal representative. During a run-in at a local cafe, she made thinly veiled threats about budget consequences if the government didn't back off. What Marla didn't realize was that threatening a federal official is a felony, and Morales had the entire exchange recorded on her government phone. The night before the meeting, my cabin looked like a war room under siege. Federal marshals were stationed outside after the threats. Locals had turned the place into a community base, neighbors bringing casseroles, kids drawing Save Our Lake posters, veterans brewing strong coffee. Agnes Murphy sat on my dock, telling stories about the lake's old festivals, while her great-granddaughter splashed in the shallows. The contrast with Marla's mansion across the water couldn't have been starker, her floodlights sweeping the shore like a prison camp. "You know the difference between you and her?" Agnes said, watching those lights slice the dark. "You're fighting for something bigger than yourself. She's fighting to keep what she never really owned." As I rehearsed my presentation one last time, a stack of federal documents, solid in my hands, the rhythmic slap of waves against the dock felt like my grandfather's steady heartbeat beside me. Tomorrow, Marla would learn that some battles pick you, whether you want them or not. The morning of the meeting, my property was ringed by supporters who'd camped overnight. Veterans in lawn chairs formed a perimeter, steaming coffee in hand. "Nobody's getting to you without going through us first," Tony said, handing me a mug that tasted like courage and camaraderie. Across the lake, Marla's mansion swarmed with black SUVs, her legal team, PR handlers, and what looked suspiciously like hired muscle. The air was thick with the scent of expensive panic. The drama started before we even entered the hall. Marla tried serving me a restraining order, claiming I'd made terroristic threats. The process server barely got 2 words out before U.S. Marshal Rodriguez stepped in and shut it down. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "you can't serve state papers on someone acting under federal authority. That's like arresting a postal worker for delivering mail." Then came the buses, loads of out-of-towners holding prefab property rights signs and reciting the same talking points. The stench of diesel and perfume filled the air, but locals saw through it immediately. Nothing unites a small town faster than outsiders trying to hijack its politics. Pickup trucks and minivans began rolling in from every direction, bringing the real residents who'd grown up on these shores. Inside, the old town hall was bursting at the seams, meant for 150 people but holding nearly 300. The ancient air conditioner wheezed against the heat of nervous energy. Marla swept in dressed for battle. Power suit, flawless makeup, and a legal entourage that looked like it billed by the heartbeat. She owned the front row like a general surveying her troops. But then came the first crack in her army's armor. Robert Whitaker, her husband, stood during the opening remarks, face pale but voice firm. "I want to distance myself from my wife's actions," he declared. "We've mortgaged our future fighting a war we can't win against rights we never truly had." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her own husband had just detonated her defense strategy in front of hundreds and 2 news cameras. But he wasn't finished. "I've reviewed the federal documents," he continued. "Our deeds are invalid. We've been living on borrowed land, and it's time to admit it." Marla's face shifted through emotions faster than a slot machine. Shock, fury, panic, and finally cold defiance. She hissed at her lead attorney, who looked ready to vanish. More homeowners began to speak up, angry over the endless fees she'd dragged them into. "We never signed up for a war," cried Mrs. Peterson from Maple Street. "We just wanted peace, not bankruptcy." The energy shifted like a tide turning. What had started as Marla's supporters versus mine became Marla versus everyone. Representative Morales scribbled notes, documenting each admission of fraud. The tension built as hired protesters grew belligerent, shouting canned slogans about tyranny, while locals shared heartfelt stories about the lake's history. The breaking point came when Marla shrieked at her husband, calling him a traitor and threatening divorce on the spot. Her voice cracked like glass against tile. "You're all being manipulated by a bitter mechanic who hates success," she screamed, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. That's when Agnes rose slowly from her seat, cane tapping the floor. "Honey," she said in a calm, clear voice that carried to the back row, "success isn't measured by how big your house is. It's measured by how you treat your neighbors." The hall fell silent. I stood at the podium, looking out over nearly 300 faces, the hum of nervous chatter fading into expectant silence. The scent of old coffee and summer sweat thickened the air like humidity before a storm. "My name is Evan Carter," I began, steady despite the pounding in my chest. "And I'm here to tell you the truth about Crystal Lake." I started with the human part, my grandfather's stories, the lake's shared past, the festivals and swimming lessons that built a community long before million-dollar fences claimed the shoreline. The projector flickered through black and white photos, children learning to swim, families picnicking where gated docks now stood. Then came the moment that would change everything. "What Mrs. Whitaker doesn't want you to know," I said, clicking to the next slide, "is that none of us actually own these lakefront properties. According to these federal records, Crystal Lake has been under United States government ownership since 1962. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, frantic whispers, all blending into chaos. Marla's lawyers scrambled with their papers while her face drained of color. "This is a communist conspiracy!" she screamed, jabbing at the screen. "You're being manipulated by government agents, trying to steal private land." But before the outrage could spread, Representative Morales rose, calm but commanding. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, her voice echoing off the walls, "I'm Janet Morales with the Department of the Interior. These are authentic federal documents. Your property deeds are fraudulent, and your mortgages were obtained under false pretenses." The cameras clicked like a firing squad as Marla's expressions collapsed from outrage to disbelief. Morales wasn't done. "Furthermore, your threats against federal officials and attempts to obstruct this investigation constitute felony violations under federal law." Marla's expensive legal team quietly began packing their briefcases, eager to distance themselves from the sinking ship. Her PR handlers whispered frantically, eyes darting toward the exits. Meanwhile, her neighbors, people she'd once ruled through fear, stood one by one to denounce her lies. "The developers misled us," shouted Jim Patterson from Lakeside Drive. "If Evan's offering a legal solution that protects us and the public, I'm listening." Even the paid protesters started backing toward the doors, realizing they'd stumbled into a federal proceeding they didn't want any part of. Then came the sound of Sheriff Douglas's boots against the wooden floor as he stepped up with official papers in hand. "Marla Whitaker," he announced, "you're under arrest for criminal harassment, vandalism, and threatening federal officials." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the stunned room. Marla froze, then started shouting as deputies led her toward the exit. "You'll regret this. Your property values will collapse. This mechanic has destroyed everything we built." Before she could be dragged outside, I raised my voice just enough for the cameras. "Ma'am," I said evenly, "we didn't destroy anything. We just gave it back to the people who always owned it." The roar that followed shook the rafters. People stood and cheered, tears streaming down faces. Children pressed their hands to the windows, watching as the private property signs came down and sunlight glinted off water that finally belonged to everyone again. Veterans saluted. Families embraced. And old-timers wept openly, their memories vindicated at last. Agnes Murphy took the microphone next, cane tapping rhythmically as she reached the front. Her voice, though aged, carried clear and proud. 60 years ago, my husband proposed to me on the public dock of this lake," she said. "Our children learned to swim here. Our grandchildren caught their first fish here. This lake doesn't belong to the government, and it sure doesn't belong to people with more money than sense. It belongs to the community that has loved it for generations." The applause that followed wasn't just noise, it was release. Decades of resentment, greed, and division washed away in that sound. Representative Morales stepped forward for the final announcement, her words sealing history. "Effective immediately, Crystal Lake is restored to full public trust under federal protection. Mediation will begin next week to balance property rights while ensuring permanent public access." Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. And as deputies led Marla out of the hall, her own community rose to their feet, applauding not her downfall, but their collective redemption. Outside, the sunset reflected off the newly liberated water like liquid gold. Veterans folded the old no trespassing signs into piles. Families waded into the shallows laughing, children splashing where gates once stood. For the first time in years, Crystal Lake sounded like home again.